Hello, everybody. This is Trip, Jake, and Jack. We're excited. It's week 2. It's time for Mary Daly. And yeah, all right, how are you feeling, Jake?
So good. And I can't believe that you're back already once
Whoa.
more.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
We didn't scare you away with the Tillich the first week, so that's good.
Tillich's not that scary. You know?
Well, we're going to try and make them scary.
All right. All right. So I hope everybody is in a well-lit room, that you've had plenty of rest, that you're, no hallucinogens are involved, because Jack's going to attempt to practice some hauntology on you. And
Make Tillich scary. I feel like that's a new hashtag. Make Tillich scary. That's the hashtag of the course.
Make telling scary again.
all right, well, now we're ready to talk about Mary Daly. So buckle your theological safety belts.
Well, today, before we do turn to Mary Daly herself, let's take a look at the title of this sequence of podcasts is Radical Theology. We've got radical theology in as our motif. And it'd be worth a moment, I think, to just briefly sketch what we mean when we say radical theology. In the most general terms, we're distinguishing radical theology from confessional theology. Theology, when you use the word theology, what you ordinarily mean, that's what I mean by confessional theology. The theology in and of some religious body. Radical theology is an inflection of that, an alteration of that, a radicalization of that, and a rethinking of it. How so? Well, the way I like to put it is to say that radical theology is a weakening of confessional theology. You could, if you were doing phenomenology, say it's a kind of suspension of something going on in confessional theology in order to release this underlying event, let's say. So let's say radical theology is a weakening of theology in the sort of garden variety sense, and in several ways. First of all, it's a weakening of the supreme being without falling into mere atheism. You can see that from what we said yesterday about Tillich. It is a weakening of supernaturalism without falling into naturalism. It's catching a middle ground or middle voice. It's a weakening of the logos in theology, of the ology in theology, without embracing irrationalism or the anti-logical or illogical. And so another way to put that is it's a weakening of theology into theopoetics. It's a weakening of belief without losing faith. There's an underlying faith which is concealed by, obscured by what we call belief, a deeper faith in the unconditional, for example. It's a weakening of religion without falling into irreligion. And you can hear that in Derrida's notion of religion without religion, or in Bonhoeffer speaking about a religion-less Christianity. It's a weakening of theology into theopraxis, so that it weakens the grip of merely theoretical thinking, library talk, seminar talk, and becomes radical in what is actually a very common sense of the word radical. I mean, when you speak of someone being a radical, you mean radical action, right? You mean radical praxis. So it's a radical theology would always be political theology. And we'll see that in both Mary Daly today and in James Cone next week. So I'm unfolding this notion of radical theology through these figures. And the reason I take Tillich as my point of departure is because you see so much of what I just said already in Tillich. Tillich would have been thought of as a liberal Protestant in his own time, but he's much more ontologically radical than that. The position is post-theistic. And I take that as the condition of possibility of radical theology. If theology remains within the notion of a supreme, omnipotent, omniscient personal being, then it seems to me that's what you mean by theism. That's theism. I take radical theology to be post-theistic. Now, when we turn to Mary Daly, we turn to a figure that this is of all of her work. It's the one that made her famous, I guess, but it's also of all of her work, the one that I like the most for several reasons. One of which is she hasn't quite given up on religion yet. She's still thinking theologically. But by the end of her life, she just thinks religion's the enemy and there's no fixing it. But in Beyond God the Father, she's still working as a theologian, and that's quite a good one. I mean, a sophisticated theologian, which is part of the reason I like it. The other thing is the influence of Tillich in this book is the most powerful of all of the books. She's quite she's making substantive use of Tillich in this book. That's important because I didn't say anything about this yesterday, but Tillich's philandering is well known, and when after he died, his wife Anna published a biography, which told us that Tillich had had his own personal sexual liberation, and it's scandalous for most of us. And the question is whether that was just some kind of personal flaw, or whether actually it's not. You know, maybe it's actually part of the. He's a very severe critic of bourgeois ethics, and consequently of sort of the classical conception of marriage. Now, the problem with that is that usually works in favor of men, not in favor of women. What's interesting to me is how Tillich would be, in many ways, a nemesis for women, a white male philandering theologian, and could at the same time be so important to Mary Daly. And I think that's an important point when we have to confront these issues. And finally, the other reason that Mary's so important to me is she's Catholic. And so she traveled she started out as a Catholic. She traveled this route from progressive Catholic to a radical feminist, post-theistic, sort of post-Tillichian theologian, to just a radical feminist, period, with no more trappings of religion at all. But I'm always interested in this journey from progressive Catholicism to radical theology. It's something like my own story. She went to Catholic schools, had Catholic degrees, and wrote a dissertation on Jacques Maritain, who was the one of the two foremost Catholic philosophers of the 20th century, along with the historian Gilson. And Maritain had something which Daly is putting together with what she's reading in Tillich. That is, he had this intuition, what he called an intuition of being. And she tries to pick it up, as a lot of people who read Maritain do, with the hyphen being, indicating that being is not a static act, but an active process. It's emergent process. And Maritain had been influenced by, was convert to Catholicism, who had been influenced by Bergson. So consequently, there's some notion of élan vital circulating in Maritain. So as he's reading Thomas Aquinas, and as he's reading what Thomas Aquinas is calling essay, and it becomes, in Maritain, a very vibrant intuition. And Daly plugs into that early on in her as a student, and it's with her. It's still with her in this book. Only now it's being melded together with the ground of being in Tillich, and Tillich's own notion of being as what we might call emergent process. So with that in mind, and then lastly, the other overarching framework here. What I said at the end of the treatment of Tillich last week, for Tillich, theology is always already situational. It's always already hermeneutical. It's always already hermeneutically situated. It's always the theology of a given culture. I actually think that what he calls the theology of culture is not a part of theology, it is theology. Theology is a given historical world, rethinking what its source formative tradition is telling it in a world that source didn't anticipate. And so theology has to be redone not only from time to time to time, but it also has to be redone from situation to situation to situation. And so theology is a theology for a woman is going to be different than classical white male theology. Theology for a black person is going to be different. Theology for in the midst of the sexual liberation and breaking of the gender binarities is going to be different. Theology will always be different, but theology is different for the impoverished. So, and theology must rise out of that situation. Now, so revelation is emergent. It emerges from the demands of the situation and the capacity of that situation to make contact with the unconditional. What drives it, what makes it theological, what gives it deep theological or radical theological energy is what Tillich was calling the ground of being, or the unconditional, or what Derrida will call the event. Now, they're not the same thing, but I'm analogizing. We'll see that as we go along. She announces her project as an attempt to have the courage to be. Now, one minor problem we've got here is that the book that she's using is not the book that we were using last week. She's not drawing so much on the theology of culture book as she is on the courage to be. But the courage to be is a very famous book. Everybody's read it. If you haven't read it, as soon as this podcast is over, sit down and read this book. Everybody should read this book. And if you haven't read this book, you have no right to talk about theology in public. Courage to be is a brilliant articulation of Tillich's thought. It's actually, in some ways, the most readable and the most, along with the dynamics of faith. The dynamics of faith, courage to be. They were both, and actually popular successes. If they were probably, if there was an Amazon back in those days, they would have been among the best sellers. So for her, the question that Tillich is posing is the courage to be in the face of patriarchy. the courage to be in the face of the demonic, the dark forces, powers, and principalities, the threat to our being. The threat to our being comes from patriarchy and from the idol of God the Father. And the entire work of theology for her, for a feminist theology, is to draw upon the resources of the ground of being, to have the courage to be a woman, to say I am, to affirm what her own being, or autonomous. Well, I don't want to actually say autonomously here. But her own being as a genuine self, in the face of all the forces all the heteronomous forces that are crushing her, crushing women. And so it's a search for a new symbol in which to link the conditional to the unconditional. The function of Talikian theology is to find the symbol which is transparent to the unconditional, which is itself conditional. It will always be finite, temporal, historical, but it will be iconic rather than idolatrous. It will open us to, expose us to the unconditional rather than trapping us inside the symbol, the finitude of the symbol itself. So the finite symbol that has trapped us, that's crushing us, that's oppressing us, is God the Father. And so the access to the ground of being, the access to the unconditional, the access to freedom must come from forging new symbols. Now, in this book, later on she thinks this is what to do, but in this book, she says the new symbol of the ground of being must be androgynous. That is to say, taking both the masculine imaginary and the feminine imaginary and synthesizing them in a higher, or let's say deeper, unity of the androgynous. So that now the ground of being pre-contains in a more primordial way, a more proto-ontological way, everything that's found in the masculine and everything that's found in the feminine. The ground of being is androgynous. Instead of saying the ground of being is feminine, she's saying androgynous. And later on, she'll revise that, because she thinks what you're doing when you do that is you're leaving both the feminine and the masculine imaginary in place, and you haven't displaced both, which is what you ultimately want to do. So it's a move she's making now. It's not a move that she's going to hold on to forever. So there's an interesting thing going on here, a Talikian thing. Tillich had this thing where he says you could think of theology, radical theology in his terms, in terms of a dialectic between autonomy, which is the rational ego, the rational self asserting itself, heteronomy, which is that self being brought under the power, the dominion, the rule of an external force. So you think of autonomy in terms of enlightenment, you think of heteronomy in terms of being dominated by a church or by a state or by a party. And he wants to displace both of them by means of what he calls theonomy. That is to say, taking one's rule not simply from the self and not simply from the other, but from the ground of being itself. And that's her model here. She doesn't want. She's not opposing a purely masculine. She's not opposing a pure autonomy to heteronomy. She's saying that genuine feminism is a deep feminism that draws upon this androgynous ground of being for its ontological, spiritual resource. Right. So feminism is not simply Enlightenment feminism here. Feminism is religious feminism. Feminism is a theological feminism, because its deep sources are ontological. And she says her method is not correlation but liberation. Now, I would simply say that's not an either or. Her method, which she calls liberation, in tune with liberation theology, in tune with Cone, is what correlation requires. If the situation from which you theologize is oppressive, then theology must be a theology of liberation. That's correlational theology, right? If your situation is not oppressed, then you don't have a liberation theology. If you theologize from the position of the comfortable and well-fed, you're not going to come up with a theology of liberation. So, theology is inescapably situational, hermeneutical, it's correlational. Now she says she doesn't like to use this word method because that's one of the boys' words. That suggests masculine rule and domination. But of course, some very masculine people like Heidegger, Gadamer, and Derrida have completely taken the word method apart and deconstructed it and have returned it to a more primal sense of our opening, the way we move along the way, which is literally what the word method means. She says she wants to, her method is to castrate this father symbol, which is a demonic and destructive force. So the first subject of this book is God the Father, the supreme being of theism. So she's saying now what's happened to her between her first book, which was basically about Vatican II and the new church and feminism. Her original project was to open the church to feminism. Part of the movement of Vatican II would be to the inclusion of women in the church. And she's moved from that to a post-theistic position. She thinks the notion of the supreme being, which constitutes the sort of heart and soul of orthodoxy, is itself patriarchal and oppressive. The supreme being has kept us in the state of infantile subjection, she says. And at this point, she's pretty much quoting Bonhoeffer when he talks about the tutelage of mankind. It's God the Father is the heteronomy. We don't have theonomy here. You have heteronomy because God is conceived of as a wholly other, transcendent, supreme, don't mess with me divinity. And that's especially difficult on women who are not adequate symbols of that. Thomas Aquinas is good metaphysician. He knew that God didn't have genitals. And so he said, God is neither male nor female. But he said, so we always have to speak about God analogically. But there's such a thing as a good analogy and a bad analogy. And he says, if you call God the mother, that's a bad analogy because you're comparing God to something feminine, to something passive and receptive, which is not capable of active rationality, but only passive rationality. The feminine is what knows how to obey a command, not give a command. Consequently, the feminine is an inadequate analogy for God. God is not male ontologically, but if you're going to speak about him analogically, you just call him a guy, right? So this figure of God the Father is irredeemable. It's irredeemable. It's intrinsically oppressive. It intrinsically suggests the binarity of commanding and obedience, rational and irrational, active and passive, aggressive and deferring. It's the law. It's everything that is utterly destructive, of course, in the history of women in the church and history of women, period. And so she says, she goes back to, again, the courage to be, she goes back to the three forms of anxiety that Tillich described. Our anxiety before the threat of non-being. She says, for women, that's serious. That's not a metaphor uh, it's the exclusion from the civil society, the relegation to the corners of the world. It's life. It's a life-threatening exclusion. Women feel the anxiety towards non-being in their biological bones. And secondly is the anxiety of meaninglessness. And she says that's exactly what women experience, because the world is modeled on male paradigms. The imaginary with which society has history has unfolded, it has always been along a masculine imaginary. Our culture is saturated with masculine models, patriarchal models, and women are exposed therefore to meaningless. They look at the world, they look at the powers of the world, and they see no place for themselves. And finally, the last anxiety talked about was the anxiety before guilt. And she says we are confronted with guilt because we appear to be, but in our rejection of orthodoxy and tradition, in rejecting patriarchy, we're rejecting orthodoxy and tradition, and we are ridden with guilt about that. That world makes us feel like heretics. And so she says, what Philip says is, in the face of anxiety, you need courage. You draw courage from the ground of being, and that courage takes the form of, first of all, the courage of being oneself. Being oneself is not pure autonomy, but it is overcoming the destructive power of heteronomous forces. It is the power to say, I am. I am. And second form that the courage to be takes is the courage to be a part of a larger whole. This is not a singular individual trying to change the world. This is a community. And the community here, the historical community here, is sisterhood. So sisterhood is a bearer of the meaning of history. Sisterhood is a bearer of the ground of being. Sisterhood is the emergence, the revelation of the divine ground in the form of this resistance, affirmation of a new ontological force that will forge a new imaginary. We cannot ignore God in this struggle. If we ignore God, we ignore the most powerful and deepest model of transcendence and ultimate reality. Our power derives from the ultimate power of reality itself. Our creativity is a participation in ontological creativity. Our capacity to dethrone false gods, which free us from our capacity to be free from idolatry, must draw upon ontological resources, must draw upon being. Now, when she's saying that, she's saying Marie-Jacques Maritain, and she's saying, she's quoting Tillich. This God who is the God of the gaps, this otherworldly being, this judge who keeps us in check. All that we resist, we reject, we face it with ontological hope, she says, ontological hope, theological hope, ontological hope. And so our notion of God is not a classical treatise on the divine names, divine predicates, what sorts of things, predications we can make of God, but what she calls naming. This is not grammatical, but it's you get it. Naming toward God, where so you can hear that sort of the new being. So Tillich's notion of the new being, the God's coming. God, the God whom we're interested in is on the way. It's coming. We're naming towards Him. We're not predicting Him, but we are trying to get there. We're trying to She's not going to give up on teleology. There is a teleology or an eschatology, which is the God ahead, the liberation ahead, the emergence of the ground of being in this new way, this new feminine imaginary. So God, she says, is not a noun, not a masculine noun, but a verb, which is neither masculine nor feminine. The verbs don't take gender. And it's not a reified being up there. So you see the radical move, the post-theistic move. It's nothing over and against us. It is the inner power within us in a kind of mysticism of sorority, or what she calls ontological reason, a reason which is not simply calculating entities, but is thinking thinking beings own incomprehensible depth, inexhaustible depth. And our God is wrathful. The wrath of God is turned on the demonic, straight to it, and where the demonic is patriarchy. The patriarchy is destructive, and whereas the demonic is destructive, the divine is creative. So this is the opening chapter. That's the first chapter after God's Father. It is an absolutely wonderful chapter. You can't find anything better than that, I think, in terms of a rich, very rich theological articulation of a genuine feminist theology and a feminist ontology. She then moves on to exorcising the evil from Eve. You see this here. Later on, she gets completely exotic, exorbitant. Her wordplay gets almost runs out of control. That's okay, right? Because you're not just playing with words. What you're trying to do is shatter images, shatter patriarchal models, shatter frameworks that trap us. Right? The function of the unconditional in Tillich and in Daly, I think in Kant too, that's a period. And in Derrida, in his way, is to break the bonds of the conventional, of the set of conditions and constructions that we live under. We need to break them. So one of the ways to break them is to unleash the foment and ferment and fertility of language itself. She's starting to do that in this book. So exercising the evil from Eve. And she says, look at a couple of really smart and very critical guys like Bultmann and Tillich, who are warning us about the dangers of myth, of misunderstanding what a myth is, of not knowing how to read a myth, of not realizing that you've got to demythologize in order to be able to understand this myth and be instructed by it. How could two guys that smart and who have done that much work on mythology and symbolism have failed to pick up on the sexism of that myth? Neither one of them ever mentioned it. It never occurs to them that it's a sexist myth. They have deconstructed it, reconstructed it, demythologized it, remythologized it, taken it apart in so many different ways, exposed it as a myth in order to understand it more deeply. Never occurred to them, either one of them, that it's a sexist myth. And it's not a sexist myth, it's the sexist myth. It's the myth of all myths when it comes to women. It's what she calls the primordial lie. And it shows up everywhere. The whole history of the West, of the biblical tradition of the Western tradition, it's everywhere. And its result is to domesticate women into behaving themselves. And it says you've got the myth of the evil Eve on the one hand, and on the other hand, a well-behaved matron, and what she calls an honest matron, which you'll see in Tillich's critique of the bourgeoisie. Tillich is a radical socialist, but Tillich says that the two great the great demons that afflict the West are capitalism, capitalism, and the bourgeois world. And he wants to break the grip of that. And so you see her say, well, look, that also involves what the bourgeois world has done to women. It's turned them into honest matrons, unless they're vixens. They've got a choice of being an honest matron or a vixen. So she said, and its ideal woman, its idealized woman, is Mary, who was a virgin, which no woman could possibly be, which can't be held up as the model of a woman. It can't be an honest matron and a virgin at the same time. So she said her answer to that is, well, we should be the deviants that we say they are. We should defy their stereotypes, flaunt them, be the evil ones they think we are. That is to say, simply defy these bourgeois constructions. The suburban wife, the good, what we'll call the good wife. Great TV show about that. Well, so how about Jesus? He calls Christianity the religion of God the Father and Son. It's God, the Father and Son incorporated. Right? It's a corporation of the Father and the Son. So what about Jesus? Now she says we got to get over Jesus. Jesus is, we can't fix that. Jesus is, the maleness of Jesus is irremediable. Women simply need a non-male symbol, and they have to get over Jesus because the ground of being is expressed in everything, not just in men, not just in Jesus. And she says, and she makes reference to a guy named Len Swidler, whom I know teaches at Temple. He's one of the leading Catholic theologians in the United States. For a long time now, he's still going. I mean, he's almost 90 years old now. And I don't think last time I saw him, he wasn't retired. And last time I saw him, he didn't need to retire. But anyway, one of the things Swidler did years ago, when this book was published in 1970, one of the things Swidler did years ago, he was a Catholic theologian who taught at Temple University, so the church couldn't get him, couldn't get fired. The archdiocese couldn't go after him because he was not teaching in a Catholic school. And he made the argument that Jesus was a feminist, right? Which you sometimes will see. People try to make that argument. People even say that about Paul, where there's neither male nor female Greek to Jew. Jesus was a feminist. And her answer to that is, so what? Even if he wasn't, I am. Jesus is not helping the case here. The figure, the model, the symbol of Jesus is not helping the case. First of all, he's a man, and second of all, he's the model of what she calls sacrificial religion. Now, one of the things you'll see in radical theology is, at least when it's radical Christian theology, is a critique of the classical notion of atonement. When I say classical, I mean the one that goes back to Anselm. It's not actually classical. It's not actually New Testament. It's Anselm, which is that Jesus took a hit for mankind. He was a sacrificial victim. God sent his son into the world to take a hit for his other children. God's something of a child abuser. He sells one. He offers one son up in one child up in sacrifice to save the other children. Jesus is a model of sacrificial religion, and women do not need to be told that they have to sacrifice. They don't need to be told that the primary virtue, the model that Jesus gives us, is the model of self-sacrifice. That's what women have been asked to do forever, and they're not going to take it anymore. And she says she doesn't think you can fix this model. They say, well, the church is male because Jesus is not a woman. Well, she says, well, Jesus wasn't Chinese either. That doesn't mean you can't be ordained, or you can't have equal rights in the church if you're not a man. It doesn't do any good to say Jesus is a male, but Christ is not, because that's not how it got played. That's not how it got played. That's not, in a pragmatic sense, that's not what it effectively means. Mary, what about Mary? Now, Mary, she's got ambiguous views of. This is the classical interpretation of Mary is a disaster, because it's an impossible symbol. It's a symbol that asks of women to not to be women, and holds up the ideal of virgin motherhood. On the other hand, she says a symbol is a symbol, and a symbol can be interpreted, and so we could interpret this differently in a new setting, which can't just come up with symbols. One of the things still I'd like to point out is symbols accumulate historically. They grow out of the culture. They're like planting a seed. You got to see if it grows. Some seeds will never grow, and some seeds will. But the ones that do take time. So you can't just create a symbol. You can't make a symbol. You can make there can be a sort of passing sensation. A certain image might have a temporal, transient, sensational success, but then it disappears. Symbols are deep. You never say of a symbol that it's only a symbol. You ever get a symbol is something that has grown over an extended period of time and has deep roots. Deep roots in the unconditional, deep roots in the unconscious. So the Jungian mentioned it. So what you could do with the figure of Mary, because it's not going to go away, is we understand it. And so she said, so you could understand her virginity as, we don't need men, which is ultimately what she thought. She at one point said, I don't care about men, I don't think about men, and I don't need men, and I don't want them in my classroom, which is how she did sort of lose her job. It's actually against the law, to do that. She says, so the nuns are, the old joke, a nun is, I don't know how to say that. The nuns actually are interesting. She's talking about 1970. In 1970, nuns by and large were a beaten lot. They were at the bottom end of the food chain of the church's hierarchy. But she says, there's something there that the nuns have that is powerful, and they have decided to lead lives without men, and to run hospitals and to run schools and to do services without men. And it was a very prophetic thing for her to say, because right now in the present state of the Catholic Church, the most liberal, the most progressive, the most outspoken group in the church are the nuns. But they're disappearing. They're not. This chastity thing is not catching on, but they are the most liberal group of people in the church, and they're the fiercest opponents of the church's patriarchy. So the Immaculate Conception could be thought of as getting rid of the old Eve, evil Eve, and the stain of the old evil Eve. Macula is the Latin word for taint or stain. So we used to have to sing a song when I was a little kid in Catholic schools, Macula non est in te, to Mary. There is no stain in you, Mary. So she said, well, let's reconceive the Immaculate Conception as no stain of the old Eve, but the Immaculate, unstained, untainted woman is free of patriarchy. And free of patriarchy's image of Mary. So then Mary would become a powerful symbol for women if we reinterpret her. And because symbols don't have, one of our objections to Tillich is, where Tillich says Christ is the ultimate symbol, he said, or the final symbol. She says, why should any symbol be the final symbol? There shouldn't be any final symbol. A symbol is a symbol. A symbol is an historical icon. It's an historical figuration. And as time goes on, there'll be other figures, there'll be different symbols, but there would never be a final symbol, and there would never be a normative symbol. He says that the symbol of Christ is a normative symbol. All other symbols, which all other symbols approximate. That's the old 19th century Hegel philosophy of religions, Hegel and Schelling, where you have pagan mythology and then you have Christian revelation. And Christian revelation is achieving the final symbol, the highest symbol, the greatest symbol. And so then the second coming of Jesus, the second coming of the Christ, will be the new being of women, where women will fully participate in the ground of being, beyond patriarchy. Then a chapter, a discussion of ethics. Now that's just very interesting because, you know, in the Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard describes the religious precisely in terms of the breach of ethics. Why? Because what's ethics? How's he thinking about ethics? Thinking about ethics as the universal, making yourself commensurable with the universal, the normative, it's the box. You know, being ethical is staying inside the box, driving inside your lane. Now, if you've got a notion of an unconditional, that doesn't work. That doesn't fit, because the box ethics are accumulated, agreed upon beliefs and practices are constructions. There are a set of particular conditions. So if you've got a notion of something unconditional, if you have a notion of something unconditional, that strains against the notion of the box or of the ethical. And you see that in the figure of Kierkegaard's interpretation of the story of the binding of Isaac, where the religious is getting out of the box, breaking the box. The box is Christendom, the box is ethics. And she's got exactly the same attitude as Tillich, and that's in Fear and Trembling, apart from the violence of that issue. She's not associating herself with that violence. So she says we need a new imaginary. We need a new feminine. She's not saying feminine imaginary, by the way. I am, but she's usually saying model. We need a new model. Can't think of women as simply complement. It's not enough to simply say we want women to have their place at the table, because the table is a masculine table. The boys made the table, and you're just trying to get a seat that one of the boys had. And she says we don't want that, and we don't want to be told that we're complementary to the boys. We need a whole new imaginary. We need to rethink this thing more radically. And so when she talks about ethics, she says, the first thing we need to do with the old ethics, the old morality, so we have to get, in Nietzsche's terms, beyond good and evil, where good and evil is the old good and evil, inside the box. And she says one of the things about the old morality is hypocrisy. It was only women who were asked to practice certain virtues like humility and self-sacrifice and meekness and forgiveness and compromise. Women were the ones who were asked to. That was particularly, that sacrificial ethic was for the women. She thinks, now here's she's Catholic, she's been trained in the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition. She thinks the trouble here is Aristotle. That Aristotle has gotten into the church's thinking, and it's gotten into more broadly into Western thinking, where Aristotle thinks in terms of prudential decisions inside paradigms that have been established by the polis. So what prudence means, or let's say discernment, when Aristotle talked about phronimos, the phronimos, phronesis. What that means is making prudential judgments, discerning how the norm applies in a given situation. That takes judgment, that takes discernment. But it's always inside a framework that has been established by the polis. It's consequently a mode of heteronomy, is from a Thalepian point of view, because it's obeying the social norm. It's obeying it's seeking pre-selected ends. It's allowing oneself to be dominated by the tradition and the system. Aristotle's ethics is ultimately conservative. Right? The conservatives like Aristotle. Plato, who was an idealist and a dualist and all these other terrible things, was the radical, right? Because he didn't think the body was all that real, and that the soul could break through the limits of any convention. So classical ethics for her is heteronomy. It's domination by the system. It's Apollonian versus the Dionysian feminist ethics, which would break loose from that Thomistic Aristotelian phronesis model for a more radical Franciscan. Let's say the two types of the philosophy of religion come into play again. A more radically Franciscan love ethic, which is diligere ad quod vis fac, love and do what you will, which would be, she thinks, an ethics of the feminine. And she thinks this, what her point is validated by the history of sexual ethics. Everything that we say about abortion, contraception, and divorce are functions of a patriarchal caste system. She makes an interesting point that is pertinent to Kohn when we get to Kohn. She says rape, genocide, and war belong to the same frame of mind. Rape, genocide, and war. They are unholy companions. And you could add to that, and she did later on, the rape of the earth. Rape, genocide, and war belong to the same frame of mind in classical ethics. Then she raises the question of the church. What about the church? Well, she says, she speaks in terms of two stages of the church. In the first, she pits the church against anti-church. The church is patriarchal, so the anti-church is a sisterhood. The church embraces the old paradigm. The anti-church embraces the new paradigm. The church reduces women to a form of non-being. The anti-church is the self-affirmation and self-expression of women. The church is the alienation of women. The anti-church is their coming into their own. The church is the vicar of Christ, therefore the anti-church is the antichrist. The church means to treat women and slaves tenderly. The antichrist rejects that love. The church's rituals enact patriarchal myths. The anti-church turns to chaos and anomie. It's strategic chaos and anomie, right? She's full professor of theology, so her notion of anomie doesn't mean burning down the building. It's a strategic anomie. The anti-church means to be the exodus from that patriarchy, the exodus from that cosmos, the chaosmos that exits that cosmos of patriarchy. The church advocates sacrifice. We advocate the affirmation of our own being. The church is a sepulchre for women. It is a dead god. To take the example of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc is a warrior in a male world, made a saint by a male church. Our Joan, in the anti-church, Joan is a heretic, a witch, a new Diane, absolutely impudent, defiant, in their face witch. Right? So you're embracing the figure of resistance. In the church, women are supposed to be silent, and she says, "I don't care if that's Deutero Paul. Doesn't make a damn bit of difference to me." She says that it's Deutero Paul. Paul didn't say it. It got into the scriptures. It's the canonical. That's the way it plays. He might as well have said it. It wouldn't make any difference. And she says, whereas we speak ultrasonically relative to that, to their silence. We speak words they don't understand. We speak beyond their language. That's the first stage, and that's what you would call in deconstruction reversal. Reversal. The second stage, she says, is beyond opposition, beyond the anti-church. So if the church was heteronomy, the anti-church is a kind of autonomy. Beyond heteronomy and autonomy is theonomy. Beyond church and anti-church is beyond male and female to a new positive spirituality, a radical spirituality that breaks these assumptions, all these assumptions, oppositional binary assumptions. She calls this sisterhood that she's articulating, formulating, a cosmic covenant. So you're getting this not only an ontological dimension, but a cosmological dimension, and consequently an ecological dimension. He says the church is, as Betty Friedan says, it's 1970, right? Betty Friedan says the church is the enemy. And she says, well, that's true, but there are certain functions, valuable functions that the church has performed. But right now they're being performed for women, not by the church, but by feminism. So feminism is a sanctuary for women. It keeps them, it allows them to regroup. Feminism is the exodus, supplies an exodus for women from patriarchy. It breaks the sexual stereotypes and forms a new covenant of sisterhood. A covenant which is a coven of witches. An invitation to rename the cosmos. It's a charismatic community. Feminism is a charismatic community, the way the church is supposed to be, which heals because it heals us from the wounds of patriarchy, which is prophetic because it's calling for a new liberation. He says this is a good point. She says, the old prophets called Israel a whore. Why didn't they call her a rapist? Why didn't they call him a rapist, the old Israel? So even liberation movements in the old church are patriarchal. So feminism is a new prophetic voice, a new liberation. It speaks in, and it has the gift of tongues. It speaks with a new meaning. And finally, it forges a cosmic covenant. Cosmic covenant, as feminism does. It reestablishes contact with fire, air, earth, and water, with the elements. Now, at this point, that's exactly like Irigaray's program. It breaks with technological reason, which is destroying the earth, and speaks in terms of the rape of the earth, and where ecofeminism is a remedy. Feminism invites women to participate in the power of the cosmos, which is a cosmological way of saying what Daly kept saying in an ontological way. Daly was talking about participating in the power of the grand being, and so does she. But she's also saying that feminism is inviting us to participate in the power of the cosmos, the universe, of the elements, of mythical fire, air, earth, and water. Sister moon and sister sun versus the culture of racism. And then the future, the final cause. And she says, well, we've been taught by modern science to suspend final causes and to think only in terms of efficient causes, mechanical causes. But she said, women can't do that. Women can't remain within the circle of the same. Women participate in being. And so it's, they don't belong to a top-down order with a preset end, where there's a telos that they're, which is fixed in place, which can't be changed, where there's some eternal being. Yahweh, that's, they don't belong to the corporation of Yahweh and Son. Yahweh and Son Incorporated is Christianity. They don't belong to that world. They belong to the order of being, which is what? Which is open-ended, creative, in which there are multiple ontophonies, theophonies, ontophonies, which disturbs the elite, disturbs the power or powers that be. So we shouldn't be intimidated by modern science's elimination of final causality. We need to think in terms of final causality, but in terms of a new open-ended finality where the end is not in sight. The end is open. Has an open-ended unforeseeability. And then a reference to Terre de Chardin. Every Catholic in 1970 said something about Terre de Chardin. Terre de Chardin was de rigueur. He was one of the heroes. John Kennedy, Pope John Paul, John 23rd, and Terre de Chardin. They were the heroes. And so she says she likes the idea that Teilhard is a process theologian, but she thinks that he's got a fixed end, a Christocentric end, whereas being has uncontainable and inexhaustible futuricity about it. And she concludes in a very interesting way. She says, a very ontological way. And I'll read that very last sentence, which is on page 198. She says, we want to get in the movement of the verbal being. Draw upon the sources of being forge the great chain of being in sisterhood. And her final sentence is, a reference to the creative, this is on page 198, the creative drawing power of the good, which is in the new being, which is self-communicating being, who is the verb from whom, in whom, and with whom all true movements move. Right? Very, very much like the line from Paul to the Athenians about that in which we live and move and be. It's the post-theistic move. It's the floating in the sea of being. It's the immersion in the inextinguishable, immeasurable depths of being, and drawing upon those depths where God is the depth, the power, and the depth, the meaning being, not a transcendent entity, which is mythological and half blasphemous for Tillich, but ontological, and I would say, because ontological, phenomenological, not a supreme being, but the depth of being itself. Here conceived by Mary Daly as an androgynous ground, rather than. All right, that's a little longer than I wanted to go, but there's a lot here, and I wanted to, even if we have to, even if it took a little bit of time, there's a really lot here. This is a really paradigmatic adaptation, I think, of Tillich to something that most of this never crossed Tillich's mind, never occurred.
Thanks a lot, Jack. One of the things that popped immediately to my mind that could be helpful is for you to share your own experience historically, both being in the academy and being, coming out as a brother, as an academic, and the whole process of joining the academy. Like, when you read Daly, you were a part and were present for the conversations within the church and the academy through multiple waves of feminism and such. So when you read this text and look back, how would you help us that weren't present for the first couple waves of feminist thought, its reception in the academy and the church, to hear it, reflect on it, and kind of capture the energy that was there?
She was a force. I mean, it was, when I started teaching at Villanova, it was mostly men. And when I was a student at Villanova, it was almost entirely men. The conscious, she was saying something that we had not heard before or seen before in the church. And I mean, I had always taken myself to be, I grew up in a completely Catholic world, but my teachers, both in high school and when I went into the Brothers, that order, were very progressive, very pushing. We were part of the, I belong to that side of the church that was pushing for Vatican II. And when Vatican II happened, that was great triumph. I mean, we really thought, we've made it now. This is the breakthrough. This is everything that will be different hereafter. I mean, everything was different, but not quite the way they proposed it. So, but in all of that progressive thinking about the church and the redefinition of the church as not as the hierarchy, but as the people of God, it took her to say, well, look, that includes women. This doesn't mean reforming the liturgy. It doesn't just mean having participation in the laity, but by the laity, because the laity are women, and the women, no matter what you do, are being excluded from the inner citadel of the church. And so she was a lightning rod. She was an electric figure who a lot of us thought was quite a hot ticket, but a lot of people thought she was crazy. And eventually, when she refused to let men in her classes, that was the validation for a lot of people, a lot of her critics. That this was just simple ideological extremist that sort of thing. But as you look back on this book, it's remarkably prophetic. There are things about it that she would herself move past, like the figure of androgyny. But it's remarkably prophetic. It's ecologically conscious. It's it's radical thinking, I think, in the most authentic sense. And so for me, she was, I followed her career with interest, and this was always my favorite book because I thought it was the most theological book. It was also, I understood it. The other books got to be quite hard to study. By the way, one of the things I forgot to mention, I wanted to mention at the beginning is when we're talking about the radical Tillich, there's a wonderful book called Rethinking the Radical Tillich, edited by Ray Manning. And in that book, one of the articles in that book is a very good piece by Christopher Rodkey called Mary Daly and the Pirated Proto-Patriarchal Paulus. Just a good way to put it. Heidegger would talk about retrieving the tradition. She talks about pirating it, which is one wonderfully saucy and impudent and defiant image. Whatever the bourgeois world condemns, that she wants to associate herself with that. But the short answer is she was a lightning rod and very, and even she even had critics among progressives who thought this was simply too ideological. And of course, that world was also still pretty Thomistic. And so what she was saying about, there was a debate going on in those days between the Thomists and the process philosophers, and it was taking place in the Metaphysical Society of America. And the Thomists were taking this, were defining God as pure act, and the process philosophers were defining God as activity, active as process. So she was taking the side of the process philosophers in this, and there's a couple of comments in there, very favorable comments about Whitehead and Hartshorne. Mm-hmm. So she was a bolt of lightning for us.
So one of the things that popped out to me as we were talking, and you're mentioning that a lot of this is happening in the same time frame in the wake of Vatican II. It's a very volatile time for Catholic theology, right? There's a lot happening, and there's also a lot of conflict, right? And what I'm thinking back to, and you mentioned this a little bit in your talk, is the notion of a symbol in Tillich, right? The notion of a symbol is a finite thing that's transparent to the unconditional. So it serves as this mediator to the unconditional, right? This object of our ultimate concern that is an icon, right? Rather than a idol, right? And the thing about the symbol in Tillich is that symbols, he says, are born and die, right? And you mentioned this a bit. And so I'm thinking here about this book and about Mary Daly, especially later getting frustrated enough with theology to just scrap this whole project, right? and I'm wondering how you mentioned that her project is to forge new symbols, right? And she's got a very sort of liberatory paradigm for what it means to forge new symbols. But my question is, can new symbols be forged, right, on the Tillichian paradigm? Is there too much artifice involved in that? Or B, if they can, perhaps part of the reason that she got frustrated, right, and ditched the theological conversation after a while was precisely because symbols take so long to take root, So anyways, that's a lot, but I'm just wondering, how do you see Mary Daly functioning? Like, is there an ethics of symbol construction in Daly, or I don't know?
Well, there is. I mean, somebody has to, the symbol, while the symbol can only be forged in an historical process, not created by a single individual, the unconditional is not somebody who does things. The only agents are people. And so you require people who catch a wave. It's, what Hegel said was, well, there are people who are speaking from out of the spirit of the age, and there are people who aren't. We use the expression "have history on their side," and there are people who are bucking the tides of history, and there are people who have history on their side. So she's got a sense, she's got a prophetic sense that women are the bearers of history at this moment. That feminism is a world historical movement in which she's trying to put her 2 cents and contribute to. She's one of the people in the boat rowing, and she's right. And I think that she, along with the feminist movement generally, have succeeded in pretty much in dethroning the image of God the Father. I think that that's a symbol that has been shaken to the roots. You can't. I don't think it's been pulled up root and branch, but I think it has been shaken, and it'll never be the same. So, yeah, I mean, this is a case of Hegel said that the spirit always requires a mediator. That it can't. It doesn't. The post-theistic position is that God is not an agent who does things. God doesn't break into history and make a revelation, which is rather the way Barth thinks about things. History works through the only decisions that are made by people. Mm-hmm. And so these people need to be themselves mediators and transparent to what they take to be the spirit of the age, and they may be wrong. Mm-hmm. I think in general, a good deal of what's, I think this book is, the continual, the fact that we're still talking about it means that she did catch something. But it would be on her own terms, the terms of this book, not her, but her attunement to the ground of being, to this, what she's calling here an androgynous ground, which is what when Hegel said that Jesus was a mediator in whom we had an intuition of the divine, but then he had to die because this isn't about Jesus; it's about the spirit, the absolute. Mm-hmm. So, but without the mediator, it won't work. It doesn't. It works through the unconditional works through mediators, and she's trying to be a mediator. She doesn't. None of these the Talekians use this distinction that we're using here between icon and idol. They just talk about true symbols and symbols that degenerate into idol. But Marion's distinction between icon and idol is really helpful. Mm-hmm. Icons don't trap you inside. They don't trap you by their glitter and bedazzle you. They make themselves transparent. So I think if we asked her this question, if we had asked her this question, she would say, well, I'm trying to be an icon. I'm trying to be transparent. I don't want you to look at me. I want you to look at what's the spirit.
Right. That's good.
One of the things you talked about was, her pushback to Boltmann and company, who are able to demythologize these texts without recognizing there's some rather obvious step to go to in a sense de-ideologicalize the text, and that to me I think is in part connected to the radical ontology she's using, right? Like out of Tillich, there's a sense that the conditions for the possibility of revelation or of the event is an ontological structure. So the event of revelation has a formal norm in the rupture, the arrival of the unconditioned. I like early Tillich when he talks about it as a breakthrough structure of religious imagination. But it's not like a norm that is content. There's not, the content is not the norm. It's the structure. And so when you when you do that, there's not the demythologizing of the text still presumes you're getting back to some content, some essence, some thing in the past that if you just got to it, this is pure faith or this is pure history. Or think of Christians are like, we need to get back to biblical Christianity, or well, that was Deutero-Paul. Real Paul and real historical Jesus are proto-feminist, and that's really good in their context. Come on. And I think that on the kind of radical picture of the event, that ontological structure, for her actually goes, no, like, you don't even have enough faith yet. You don't even got the courage to be yet. Do you realize what this tradition you're in is harboring is that call of naming towards God, where theological reflection is not regurgitation. It's kind of an eschatological projectile towards the tradition on behalf of what it harbors. And so the idea that you could demythologize without identifying and wanting to resist the ideologies it gets at is to fail to realize the radical nature of the event itself.
Right. I mean, that's yes. I that's exactly right. I mean, is that something you think that? What's the was there an objection in there to Tillich or to?
Oh no! I was just thinking that because part of like the story of Eve has this myth of domestication and all that kind of stuff in it, and they're trying to demythologize the myth without addressing the ideology. And I think the same thing will come up next week when you have, just think of most of the responses you get when like some white dude says, "Why are you making Jesus black?" Like there's a sense that some liberal Christians, progressive Christians, are happy to demythologize the text because in one sense it distances you from something that's authoritative that claims over you. And I think what Tillich is doing and what Daly is doing here is actually going like, no, the authority's there, and when it comes, it's going to bust stuff up and it's going to call something new out. And so the radical nature of what Daly and Tillich are talking about it is not a dismissive statement to the heart of faith that a lot of people are wanting to save. It's actually on behalf of its beating,
That's
the
right.
pulsing of the heart.
Yeah, the idol destroys the true authority and the real binding power of the tradition because it makes it foolish. It makes it unbelievable. But using the resources of demythologization, of deconstruction, and of Tillich's own Protestant principle, you release the genuine authority, the real power of the unconditional. There's something, I spend a certain amount of time with the people at the West Star Institute, and they're wonderful historians and they do wonderful work tracking down the authentic sayings and what's authentic in the tradition. And I've gotten together with one of them, and we're working on a common project in which we're trying to say that's not the last word. Once you've exposed this historical critical facts as best we can anyway, that's not the last word. That's a preliminary word to exposing yourself to the genuine power of these stories. the New Testament. That's what I like about the notion of theopoetics. One of the reasons I use the notion of theopoetics, because what I think the New Testament is a poem about what the world would look like if God ruled, not the powers and the principalities. And it's a perplexing and paradoxical and parabolic poem, which has a power, a real power, which stands free of the historical critical results. Not because of the divine revelation, but because it's I would say, a phenomenological revelation. It's an inbreaking of a topsy-turvy world in which we forgive those who offend us and love our enemies. And so it's asking for something, it's a kind of logic of the impossible, which is its real power. Its real power is completely obscured if you start saying, oh, look, Jesus is God and he walks on water. Well, you turn it, but you make it foolish. The power of Jesus is not that he walked on water. The power of Jesus is what that story is saying. And Tillich certainly is. Tillich is giving you sort of an ontology to back all that up. I think what backs it up is a phenomenology, not an ontology. That's the point I'll make in the last class. But it was wonderful about this book is how deeply she's drawing on that ontology. She thinks that you need the right ontology, otherwise otherwise the argument will lack depth. And it was interesting that the first book that Tillich wrote, or one of the first books, not the first book, but the book got kicked out of Germany, the socialist position. His argument was National Socialism is bogus. It's bogus socialism. Communist socialism is arid, rationalistic, and desiccated socialism that turns into totalitarianism. Why? Because it's not prophetic. It's not religious socialism. Religious socialism draws upon the depths of being. So the liberation has to have a religious dimension. For Mary Daly in this book, and for James Cone throughout, has to have a religious dimension. And for Tillich, that would be true because it draws upon the unconditional affirmation of something of inexhaustible depth and uncompromisable importance. So theology would always be political for him. One thing about Tillich is that after he got to the United States, I think he was sort of happy to be in America, and his sharp socialist tongue was tamed a little bit. And the great crisis, the great situational hermeneutical crisis for him was National Socialism and World War I. And he didn't, as Cone will point out, and as she points out, he didn't pay attention to something that he should have been paying attention to, and that is this racial relations in the United States. And it just never hit him. The question of women just never hit him. But that's not to say that he was a naive theologian, because his theology was forged in Verdun and in the Weimar Republic and the National Socialist seizure of power. It was deeply, deeply political. But I think he lost a little bit of his political voice after he came to the United States. That's part of the reason he may have lost some of his timeliness after he died. Maybe. And recovering that voice is part of the recovery of Tillich.
Yeah, that's really nice. I don't have anything else. Oh, I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry.
There you
go. When you brought up the question around, is that echoing?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know.
So hold on, I wrote it down. One of the questions I had that might be helpful is if you think of Daly's critique of patriarchy, and how would you compare it or contrast it with other forms? Like Daly's approach is a more kind of revolutionary type of feminist critique, and then there are some who are more revisionist, right? They would never write the anti-church chapter. Um, Someone like Rosemary Radford Ruther or Sally McFay, both of whom are very committed feminists, make similar eco-feminist type of responses, will share a lot of the, like, until you get to the anti-church chapter, could have a lot sharing there, but they're more revisionist in their relationship to the church. And then you could get someone that's kind of a less radical, someone like Elizabeth Johnson, who's more of a reformist, and she who is observes the way the language of God functions to structure reality, and will make those observations, and then goes on to demonstrate that high quality Orthodox Catholic Trinity can be articulated completely in feminist language. And so you can reform the practice of language in the church without having to, jettison a lot of the doctrines and things that that Mary Daly identifies in the when she joked about the Father and Son Incorporated, and all it and Anselm brings along with it.
Yeah.
So can you kind of help us?
She says at the very beginning, you remember at the very beginning of the book, she says, I'm positioning myself as a Telekian gesture on the borders. I'm on the borders. And Tillich always said that about himself. And he was on the border between philosophy and theology, between faith and reason, etc. And she says, I'm on the borders between the church and the non-church, and between this patriarchal church and no church at all. And I actually think that is strategically the best position. Where she eventually went, we already had that. We already have either secular feminists or post-religious feminists. What does more good if you could stand it, and particularly with Catholicism on this issue, it's hard to take. Well, what does more good is someone who stays inside, who knows the protocols of the system, which they are continually disturbing and disrupting and resisting and critiquing from within. I think strategically, that's a better deconstructive position. Once you're outside the thing, then the position is not deconstruction; it's critique. It's just critique. That's an object of critique, and you're not a subject in the system. You've left it. Deconstruction works from within, and that's one of the reasons I like this book. I think one time I was invited to speak in Utrecht, and the Catholic Faculty of Theology in Utrecht, and we were invited to dinner that evening by someone who was priest, and this woman answered the door, whom we all thought, this is like in the 80s, we thought was the housekeeper. It wasn't the housekeeper; it was his lifelong companion. And so by the end of the evening, after I had enough wine, I said to him, why don't you just leave the church and leave the priesthood and get married? And he said to me, great line, I've never forgotten it. He said, because it's not their church. It's not their church. And I'm not I'm not leaving, and I'm not playing by their rules. And so that's a perfectly deconstructive posture. It was Derrida's posture himself as a philosopher who proved himself. He said, you have to prove yourself according to the protocols of the university, but so that you operate within the university, but in such a way as to disturb the university. That's actually, call that Reformation rather than revolution. I don't know, but I call it. It's the difference between working inside. It's what working on the slash, inside outside.
Well, and I think that today there are a lot of the question of should I stay or should I go, or the seeking the courage to say, it's not their church is a question a lot of evangelicals are wrestling with for patriarchy's purposes, along with a lot of other questions. And Mary Daly's own journey, is one where different positions are occupied in her own life. But I think the question of that are raised in this class can really be helpful for people framing those questions all the time. Because I know from my podcast, I'm sure you both all had this experience where you get an email from someone and it's like a 6-page life story explaining that, in the very tradition that has blessed them and sent them to seek justice, to be trained to be the gifted presence of calm and dangerous and troubling times, to go into the room in the hospital and speak peace, all those types of things that ministers give their life to. Then they have this, they discover more and more sickness and ideologies present in the tradition and have to decide like what their relationship's going to be with it. And that drawing that distinction between being deconstruction happens from within and figuring out how to exist on the boundary. I think there are people, that are called to be there. And then there are some who being there is not a healthy and safe thing for them. And so you're like, yeah, get out and go find a community where you don't have to deal with any of this BS. Yeah, but it's definitely a difficult thing to negotiate. And then you never know, you might just be like Jake and get a Catholic spiritual director, hang out with Catholics all the time, and go to Episcopal Church.
It's not the worst thing in the world. Yeah, and the only thing I'd add to that is I think what is really coming out into like an In Mary Daly is I have my own reservations about the metaphysical picture in Tillich. But I think, and this is something that you've sort of highlighted a little bit, Jack, I think that what they're pointing to is an experience of wanting to remain faithful to a deeper truth that they've encountered in a tradition without having to sort of swallow the tradition whole, right? Finding places where the tradition is at odds with itself, like this life force that is in animating things, right? This encounter with this religious ground, with God, with the ground of being in Tillich's terms, right? That's a real thing, right?
That's the heart of it.
Right. And I think it's really important, and I see this a lot in people who, well, I mean, I left the evangelical church. I see it in a lot of people who have taken that journey, and there's at least a period, and sometimes it ends, where there's a feeling of being disconnected from that, being lost, not having any way to sort of mediate that, right? And it can be really difficult and really
you've lost your mediator.
Exactly, yeah. And so I think, as much as I do have reservations about the Tillichian metaphysics, like I do think it names something real that I think is important to sort of put your thumb on, because just because you leave a particular configuration of religious tradition doesn't mean that you therefore have to cut yourself off from profound, transcendent.
And you won't anyway. But when you're finally out of your last word and we're about to close the lid, and we look back at the history of your life, we'll say, this is clearly the work of somebody who was born and bred in this tradition, spent their whole life sort of burrowing deeper into it and reinterpreting it and understanding it in a new way. You won't. People say to me, why do you choose to speak about God all the time? And I said, I didn't. I didn't choose this. I can't. This is the way I talk. You know, from the time I opened my eyes in the world, this is the way everybody around me talks. This is about who I am. It's just a question of understanding it. And I understand in a way that people find offensive, and some people say you saved my life, and some people, just think it's obsolete. But I would say the very essence of radical theology is establishing a gap or a distance, a separation between this depth element, in Tillich's terms, and its embodiment, its actualization between the unconditional and the conditional. Radical theology has to have some version of this distinction between the unconditional and the conditional. Otherwise, it's going to be confessional theology. And confessional theology, I think, confuses the symbol with what it's a symbol of. Unless it's, and then I think what happens is a lot of radical theologians are simply confessional theologians who are about to lose their job, who are breaking through. Like Cone, at the very end of his life, you'll see in this book, Cone's relatively orthodox, so maybe more Barthian than Tillichian. But at the end of his life, he began to think, Christianity is just one of the ways. And I think, it seems to me, I don't understand why anyone who spends their life thinking about this, how anyone who spends their life thinking about this, could possibly reach any other conclusion. I must say, I have a hard time understanding that. But anyway, I think we've covered the ground.
All right.
Well, we've covered the ground of being.
Well, I think that's what job number one for confessional theologians: covering the ground of being.
Uncovering the ground.
Well, that's what radical theologians do: uncover it. All right, next week, James Cone.
All right.